Today we're going to talk about process costing. We're going to look at this example, which comes from our textbook. This is Department C, and we have the work in process for March 1st. It says all processing is added at the beginning of the period. That's something that we're going to need to know. Very important information that we're going to need to know a little bit later. So we're going to go ahead and highlight that so that we know that we have it. Our beginning inventory is March 1st. We had 1,200 pounds that were 20% complete. We don't need to worry about the percent complete for beginning inventory, so we can just ignore that for now. Then we have our dollar amounts, and we have the rest of the information that we need. The first thing it asks us for is the physical flow of units, and we have to calculate the amount of pounds transferred out. To do that, the physical flow of units documents the process of what we had to get, what units we had to work with, and then what happened to those units. So what we will do, first we will take the units in beginning work in process. Again, we're talking units, not dollars. So the units come from March 1st, and in this case my units are in pounds, so we have 1,200 pounds on March 1st. We need to know how many units were started this period. That's going to come from the costs incurred this period. It said 9,000 pounds were started. Then we need to know the total. So we're just going to add those two numbers together. And we find out that we had 10,200 pounds of material that we were working on. Next, we need to explain what happened to those units. We know that the total units to account for and the total units accounted for have to be the same. So we are going to make sure that those totals are the same. There are only two things that can happen to units. Either they're completed or they're not completed. So we need to document what was completed and what wasn't completed. We know that in ending inventory, which is March 31st, we have 1,800 pounds. So if we have 1,800 pounds, in ending work in process, we need to figure out what happened to the rest of the units. So we will calculate the amount that was completed by taking the 10,200 units minus the 1,800 units in ending work in process. And we find that we had 8,400 units completed and transferred. So again, in the reconciliation, both of these totals must agree. The first column tells us what we were working on, and the second column tells us what happened to those units. Was it completed or not completed? Then the next section wants journal entries for the cost incurred. We don't need to do journal entries for the beginning inventory because those were already entered in the previous month. These were just carried over to this month. So we're interested in recording the costs, that means the dollar amounts, that were incurred this period. So we have direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. These are the same entries that we did in job costing. Whenever we record these costs, we debit work in process and we credit whatever it's coming from. So for direct materials, we're going to debit work in process inventory. The amount is 36,330. And direct materials, that is not an account. It comes out of materials inventory or raw materials inventory. Either one is perfectly fine. And the amount should be the same. The debit should always equal the credit. For our direct labor, it also goes into work in process. The amount given in the problem is 10,880. Direct labor comes from factory payroll, or you could use wages payable. Either one would be fine there as well. For our overhead, we're recording the cost in work in process because that's where we want to record that we've begun the process. And it is coming out of overhead. You could also use factory overhead or manufacturing overhead. Any of those is perfectly fine. The next section we have is to calculate equivalent units for material and conversion. Remember, conversion costs is direct labor and overhead added together. We can do those combined as conversion, or we can separate them into their own columns for direct labor and overhead. I will show you both methods, but either one is acceptable. So for our equivalent units, under the weighted average method, we are only interested in these items. These items are our units completed and transferred and our units in ending work in process. Those are the ones that we're going to be working with. So for our units completed, it is always 100% complete because the item is finished and we won't be doing anything else to it. So we're going to take the number of units completed and transferred times 100%, which is going to give me 8,400 units. And that's going to be for both materials and conversion. If I wanted to separate out direct labor and overhead, I could do that in two separate columns, but the amounts are going to be the same. The number of units are exactly the same for direct labor and overhead. It gets a little bit more complicated when we get to units and ending work in process. That's our next section, and where we're looking at the 1,800 units times the percent complete. The percent complete can be different for materials and conversion. If we look in our problem, it said all materials are added at the start of processing. If we receive all of the material at the beginning, that means it's 100% complete because we're not getting any more of the materials. For our ending inventory, again, we don't care about beginning inventory percent completes, but for our ending inventory, it says that the conversion cost is 80% complete. So we're going to take the 80%, because it is 80% complete. So we'll do materials first. For materials, we're looking at the 1,800 units. At 100% complete would be 1,800 units. For conversion, our 1,800 units, we're going to take times 80%, and that's going to give us 1,440 units. If we did this with separate columns for direct labor and overhead, the process would be exactly the same. My units completed, or units in ending work in process, would be 1,800 for materials. For direct labor and overhead, they are going to be the 1,800 units times 0.8. That's not going to be divided between these two columns. It's going to be the same for each column because we're still talking about the number of units that we're working on. So then we get our total equivalent units. Our next step will be to assign a cost per equivalent unit. For our cost per equivalent unit, we first need to document the dollar amounts. So we need to know what the dollar amount of cost in beginning work in process. And we're going to get that from the problem information. This is going to be from March 1st, and we want the dollars. So that's going to be 70.20 for materials. For direct labor, it was 24.04, and for overhead, it is 18.60. For conversion, we're going to just add the direct labor and overhead together. For costs added this period, we're going to look in the problem information. We're going to look in this section for the dollar amounts. It was 36,330 for materials. For direct labor, it was 10,880, and for overhead, it was 17,820. Again, we add direct labor and overhead together to get the conversion. You can do it this way with one column for direct labor and overhead, or you can do it this way with separate columns for direct labor and overhead. Either way will get us the same results. Then we just add the costs together to determine the total costs for this process. Next, we will divide it by our total equivalent units. This is going to come from C above, and we got that from right here. So we calculated total equivalent units, and we just bring that down. We're going to get a cost per equivalent unit by dividing total equivalent units from the cost per equivalent unit. So my cost per equivalent unit is $4.25 for materials, and it's $3.35 for conversion. If we separated it out into direct labor and overhead, you can see that the combined cost of direct labor and overhead is $3.35. So we're going to get the same results. Now we get to assign the costs to units completed and ending work in process, because that's what we're trying to determine, is this cost of ending inventory and the cost of what was completed. So for direct materials, what we are going to need to do is we're going to take the cost of units, the equivalent units, times the 4.25 material cost per unit. This is going to come from this section because we are looking at the items that were completed. So we want to focus on those items, what was completed. So we're going to take the 8,400 equivalent units and we're going to multiply that by the cost per equivalent unit. We're going to do the same thing for the conversion, but the conversion cost is $3.35 per unit. So we're going to take the 8,400 units from units completed and we're going to multiply it by 335. If we did it separately, with separate amounts for direct labor and overhead, the process would be exactly the same. We're going to take the materials times the cost per equivalent unit, the direct labor times the cost per equivalent unit, and the overhead times the cost per equivalent unit. Notice how the amounts are the same if we did the combined conversion cost or if we separated out direct labor and overhead. The cost assigned to units completed is exactly the same. Now we need to do the cost assigned to ending work in process. And to do that, from the equivalent unit section, we're going to use the units in ending work in process. We're going to use our equivalent units here, and we're going to multiply it by the cost per equivalent unit we calculated in Part D. So we'll take the 1,800 units times the cost per equivalent unit for direct materials, and for conversion we had 1,440 units times the cost of $3.35 per unit. We could do it by breaking out direct labor and overhead, and we can see those calculations there. So we would just take these amounts times the cost per equivalent unit. Again, notice the amounts are the same either way that we decide to do it, combining the conversions or separating them out. The last thing it asks us to do is to prepare the journal entry to transfer units completed to finished goods. In order to do this, we want to know what was completed. So that means we need this number here. This is the cost assigned to units completed. We don't want the total. We only want the cost assigned to units completed. We are trying to transfer it to finished goods, so that means we are going to debit finished goods inventory for that $63,840, and it's coming out of work in process because these items are completed and are no longer in process, so we will be crediting work in process for that difference. Hopefully this helps. If not, review the exercises, the demo problems that we have as well, and don't forget to ask questions if you have them. Thank you.